You need to remember, maybe from middle school, about the governments that were coming into power in Europe directly after World War One, and those were totalitarianism or totalitarian states. If you don't remember what that is, it's when the government controls everything. They're going to control all aspects of your life. It may be in the form of fascism, or in the form of communism, or in the form of a dictator. But the state is going to hold all the control in a totalitarian state. So you can see the picture, the government's got its hand over the individual, no individual rights. So the totalitarian leaders that are emerging are going to be Benito Mussolini in Italy, Emperor Hirohito of Japan, and then of course we're going to focus on Adolf Hitler of Germany. So you do need to realize what a totalitarian state is, that it is going to control all aspects of life, and that those governments were emerging during this time period. At World War II in two theaters. We look at it in the European theater, which involves, of course, Europe and Germany, and then we also look at it in the Pacific theater, and that's going to involve Japan and Emperor Hirohito. So we're going to start for ease with Europe. You're probably the most familiar with the European side of the war. Of course, it's Germany rising to power, Hitler taking power. When you think about Hitler's rise to power, what you need to remember is that he's coming to power with the purpose of undoing the Treaty of Versailles. So if you don't remember what the Treaty of Versailles is, definitely go back and remind yourself. He's going to retake the lost lands, the land that he lost in the Rhineland. He has this idea of Lebensraum, and Lebensraum is this idea of living space, because Germany was so constricted, its borders were so shrunken after World War I, that he felt like the German people didn't have any room to breathe, and that's going to be something that the German people can rally around and really get behind. He's going to remilitarize. All of these are in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. To power, it's important to realize that things that happened in the past, the Treaty of Versailles and World War I, are dramatically affecting the future, or what happens in World War II. Great Britain and Europe do not want to go to war again. They just fought a war that was supposed to end all wars. They're in the middle of a depression. They're dealing with economic troubles, the troubles of rebuilding after a war. So they adopt a policy of appeasement. And what appeasement is a diplomatic policy aimed at avoiding war by making concessions or compromises to an aggressor. So that they know that Germany is violating the Treaty of Versailles, but they don't want to go to war so badly that they're willing to look the other way or to appease. And this is not just a policy that was strictly for Great Britain during this time period. You can see it again throughout history, even sort of in today's modern times. You might see this fear of going to war and appeasing an aggressor. Germany gain while Great Britain was using this policy. Well, first he's going to go into the Rhineland, and the Rhineland, of course, is the border between Germany and France. And that area was demilitarized with the Treaty of Versailles. So that's in direct violation. Remember those shrunken borders and this idea of Lebensraum. He's going to go into Austria. And then he's also going to go towards Russia in the Sudetenlands. Of course, there has to be a point when appeasement ends, and that's going to be with the annexation of Czechoslovakia and then Hitler's invasion of Poland in 1939. So if you need something to say, well, what started World War II in Europe, it's going to be these two things. This is when Great Britain says, okay, that's enough. So how was Hitler able to very quickly, in this time period when Great Britain and Europe were all having a policy of appeasement, how was he able to take over so much territory? Remember his military strategy of blitzkrieg. And Blitzkrieg is the German word for speed and surprise. It was a lightning war. If you think back to previous wars, they were pretty slow. You had long supply chains, you had a slow buildup of military, and then you might meet on a battlefield. Well, Germany took on a new approach when they would move very quickly into a town, take over the territory, and they would already occupy it before the enemy even knew they were there. And this was very new and very unique to Germany, and that's how they were able to get so much territory very early on. So they are able to start moving through Europe very quickly. They move into France. France just sort of lays down their arms and says, we give up. So now they're going to focus their attention on Great Britain. They're going to begin bombing campaigns. Remember, in World War I, it was all about U-boats, right? The German U-boats were bombing. Well, World War II, it becomes this battle in the air for the first time. We've got planes. Hundreds of German warplanes are going to bomb London every night. Something like 57 nights of attacks, and 40,000 are going to die. London calls this the Blitz. So this air raid campaign on England is is devastating. It's very, very devastating. It looks like in Europe during this time. So you can see it's all across the globe. At the Pacific Theater, or the war in Asia. So the war in Asia, of course, is going to focus around Japan. Japan is actually undergoing sort of an economic boom, and they need room to grow. They're a bunch of islands, right? So they don't have a lot of natural resources. They're importing a lot of oil, they're importing a lot of steel, but if you've ever seen images of Japan, you know, it's very crowded, and they want to spread out and be able to have more potential to grow. And of course, the closest place for them to expand to is going to be mainland China and an area called Manchuria. So Japan invades China. The League of Nations, of course, remember the League of Nations was that governing body at the end of World War I that was supposed to maintain the peace, doesn't stop it. Well, Japan is a deciding member, right? Remember, everybody has to vote unanimously, and they say it's okay, so nothing happens. So the League of Nations is pretty worthless. America is going to try to stop some of the invasion by placing an embargo on oil because, like I said, they import 80% of their oil. But they go into China and they just absolutely massacre people when they move into these cities. And even to this day, China calls World War II the War of Japanese Aggression because it was just horrific. You don't need to know the specific battle that was happening before the bombing of Pearl Harbor and America gets involved. So let's talk about America's involvement. Of course, want to stay neutral, right? We have fought World War I. We didn't join the League of Nations, but were we really neutral? We did pass the Neutrality Acts, and the purpose of the Neutrality Acts were to keep us out of war. But they really tied the hands of Franklin Roosevelt, who's president during this time, when he wanted to help the Allies, right? We have very strong ties to Great Britain and want to help them, but because of the Neutrality Acts, he can't. So he tries to start sort of amending the acts so that he can and help them in any way he can. So the original Neutrality Acts said that you could not sell to any belligerent nation, right? So a belligerent nation is any nation that's at war. But he's going to amend it to include something called a cash and carry. And this basically said that anything that's not weapons, food, oil, raw materials, that those nations can come to America and buy them with cash. And it will take their cash, put the goods on their ships, and they can sail away with them. And that's okay. Remain neutral. So we're doing that. We're doing cash and carry. Well, it's not enough. And so FDR looks at doing the Lend-Lease Act. And basically, it let us lend supplies to Great Britain and to Russia with the understanding that we would be paid back eventually. we understood that we may not get paid back, but we wanted consideration after the war, and this is actually going to allow us to become a world power. So that's important to understand, that the Lend-Lease Act let us, after the war, not shrink back into isolationism, because we had lent them a lot of supplies. And if they're not going to pay us, we better have influence. So even before we declared war, with with bombing of Pearl Harbor and America officially declares war, we're already sort of in an undeclared naval war, because we're protecting these ships as they go out, the goods that are on them in the cash carry, and of course with the stuff that we're lending them. So that's why I say we're neutral, because Americans didn't want to go to war. So they didn't have the American support. And you really have to have American support when you're going to war. And you can see that even today. If you lose the war in Iraq, you lose the Americans' will to fight, you've lost the war before you've even started. So FDR knew without American support, he had to do as much as he could without actually declaring war. Of not getting involved and America staying out of it is called isolationism. And of course that comes out of, we didn't want to be involved because we'd already fought World War I, and we were in the middle of the Great Depression. And the Great Depression was this thought that, we have so many problems at home, focus on America first. Don't get involved in European affairs. Go out into the Atlantic. He meets with Churchill on a boat, and they talk about, well, what happens after the war, and they sort of hammer out their ideas for peace, talking about, well, there shouldn't be any territorial gains. This is important to note, because we're going to come back to this when we look at the United Nations. The United Nations is going to be based off this Atlantic Charter that they worked on before America was even involved in the war. So when it involves us, right? When it directly affects America. And of course that comes with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Japan is very tired of America's embargo on oil and steel, and they decide, you know what, we're going to do something. And so they bomb us. When they bomb us, of course, Germany, who is Japan's ally, immediately also declares war. So now we're involved not only in war in Japan, but war in Europe. This is where it gets a little bit tricky. There are so many American battles. There's so much that we did, and you can spend days and days looking at the tactics and all that. I mean, the Battle of France, the Battle of Kirk, Operation Barbarossa, Gaul, Battle of Iwo Jima. These are all fantastic American contributions. But we can't focus and we can't cover it all. So what we want to look at is, what do we specifically need to know for this course? Theater, you need to know about island hopping. And island hopping was the strategy in the Pacific because of the geography, right? Japan is an island, and it has a bunch of outlying islands. And they bombed Pearl Harbor, and that sunk a bunch of our naval vessels. And when we go to fight Japan, we can't fight mainly in Japan. We're going to fight on all these little islands, because we need a place to have a base to station supplies, planes, and fly out of. Because to be honest, to get a plane from the United States all the way to Japan to drop bombs, that's quite a feat. You can't, the planes don't fly that far. You've got to stop, refuel. We've got to send out ship carriers. So island hopping was this idea of going from island to island, gaining a foothold, getting an airstrip, having a place to bring in supplies. So island. You do need to be aware of the Battle of Midway. That's the one battle that they want you to really know about. And it's the turning point in the war in the Pacific. We were constantly on the defensive, right? Because they had bombed us, and we were always going into these islands, and they were already there. We're trying to push them off. But once we won the Battle of Midway, we had an airstrip, and we started accumulating supplies, and now suddenly we were on the offensive, and it had a lot to do with code breaking. There's some fantastic movies about the Windtalkers and the Navajos, and it was a really interesting time. So definitely remember that the Battle of Midway was the turning point for the war in the Pacific. So now let's take a look at what we were doing in the other battles. You need to remember the Battle of Normandy, or D-Day. So the Battle of Normandy was like June 1944 to August. And what it's important for is because once we landed on the beaches of Normandy, the largest amphibious invasion, that started the liberation of Europe. We landed on the beaches of Normandy, and then we were able to start systematically going city to city and pushing the Germans back. We took back France. We started marching towards Berlin. So that's really important as the turning point for the war in Europe. It's often called the beginning of the end of the war. If you've ever seen Saving Private Ryan or any of those other movies, a lot of them show this scene because it's so dramatic. With the invasion of Normandy, that's going to signal sort of the end of the war in Europe, and we want to look at what happened after the war. And FDR, of course, got us into the war and was leading us through the majority of the war. Unfortunately, he will not live to see it to the end. He's going to die in 1945 of a cerebral hemorrhage. Of course, he had already been sick. He had polio as a child and spent some of his presidency in a wheelchair. And FDR, of course, is one of those greater-than-life presidents. He was president during the Great Depression, and he had the New Deal policies. He was president during Pearl Harbor in World War II, and he's the only president to be elected 4 times. So he was greatly respected and loved by the American people. His death, his vice president Truman is going to take over, and he's going to be the one responsible for figuring out how do we take Europe from a war-torn country and make it a peacetime country, right? And he's going to have to deal with Stalin and what to do about Russia. And then has the problem of ending the war in the Pacific. Japan is very determined, and it looks like this could be a continued war, and Truman doesn't want that. He wants to get American troops home, save American lives, and so he's going to be the one who makes the decision to drop the atomic weapon, the atomic bomb, on Hiroshima. This is a big decision. I mean, atomic weapons had never been used, and it sort of is going to be a very scary decision because once you drop the bomb like that, it can cause all sorts of problems, and we'll see that when we study the Cold War. So he is going to drop the bomb. It's going to wipe out 60% of the city. 348,000 people are going to be just killed immediately. Of course, you've got other people that are going to be missing or injured. Truman didn't know about the atomic bomb for very long. It was done in secret in America. It was codenamed the Manhattan Project. He didn't know about it until he became president. But he did make that decision because he believed that it would save American lives in the long run, not to be involved in a long-term war with Japan. So the things that you need to know for a U.S. history class, I'm going to try to condense them down and give you sort of just like the bullet points. So you need to know that in 1939, Germany is going to invade Poland with the Blitzkrieg, and that's going to start World War II in Europe. In 1940, you've got Germany conquering France. Germany's going to be bombing England. Germany's going to invade the Soviet Union. In 1941, Japan's going to drop a bomb on Pearl Harbor, and World War II starts in the Pacific, and of course, America enter the war. 1943, you need to remember the turning point for the Pacific War was the Battle of Midway. You need to remember that German troops are going to surrender in Stalingrad, so that's definitely going to weaken Germany. And then, of course, D-Day is June 4th. In 1945, you've got Hitler committing suicide, and the war in Europe is over. Remember V-Day. V-Day stands for Victory Day. You may see that on some tests. the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima and then on Nagasaki, and then the war in the Pacific is over. So a very condensed view. Those are the most important things that you need to know for this history class. I suggest, of course, that you expand your knowledge and you can watch the crash course videos. They're number 36 and number 37. There's a TV show that I really like. It's called Foyle's War. It's on Netflix, and it talks about the home front from being in London and bombs dropping during the Blitz. Of course, Band of Brothers, if you have lots of time and want to watch a very long television show about World War II. And then, of course, the Pacific, which is the other side, the other theater. I'm not really sure what happened to the History Channel. It used to be much more. They've got a bunch of live TV shows now, but they do have D-Day in HD, which is pretty nice. In this lesson, there was so much information, lots of websites to look at. Definitely feel free to look at any of these websites to give you a better understanding. And I will see you next time.